I never believed in ghosts, at least not until that night. You know, the kind of thing you hear in campfire stories, something to spook you for a second, then you brush it off. But but when I signed up for that summer job as a fire lookout, I never expected it would change my view of the world forever. It was the middle of July when I got the job. I had just graduated from college and needed something to do for the summer. The work was supposed to be easy, isolated, and peaceful, sitting in a tower overlooking the forest, scanning for wildfires. No one told me how dangerous being alone out there could be. But, I mean, how could anyone prepare for something like this? The tower itself was old, built in the 60s, perched on top of a steep mountain. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat where you could relax and just watch the world below. I'd be stationed alone for weeks at a time, with only my radio to communicate with the outside world. I liked the idea of solitude at first, but that quickly faded once night fell. The first couple of nights were fine. I would climb up the rickety steps to the tower, unlock the door, and settle in. I had everything I needed: books, a radio, and a little stove for making tea. But there was this strange, unnerving quietness to the forest at night, one that wasn't like the usual stillness I was used to. There were no animals, no crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, just absolute silence. The first night that things started to go wrong, it was just after sundown. I was scanning the horizon with my binoculars when I saw something strange in the distance. It wasn't a fire, but it was too close to the ridge for comfort. A figure, a silhouette, stood in the clearing, completely motionless. At first, I thought it was a bear or a shadow from the trees, but it wasn't. It was too tall, too human. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, perhaps. Maybe someone else was out there, lost, or a hiker who had strayed too far from the trail. But the longer I stared, the more uneasy I became. The figure didn't move. Not an inch. It was like it was watching me, waiting. Eventually, I had to tear myself away from the binoculars. I couldn't keep looking at it. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was too tired. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the tower creak and groan. But there was another noise, one that I couldn't ignore. Faint tapping. At first, it sounded like something scratching at the window. Then it moved. A soft thud followed by another tap. It was as though someone was trying to get in. My heart raced as I turned on the flashlight and scanned the room. But there was nothing. No one. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon, climbing the side of the tower. I pushed the thought out of my head and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come. Not again. The next day was almost uneventful, though there was a lingering unease in my gut that I couldn't shake. I went about my duties, scanning the forest for any signs of fire, but the figure I had seen the night before was still on my mind. Something didn't feel right. I kept an eye out for movement, but nothing ever came. As the sun dipped behind the mountains that evening, I saw it again. The figure. But this time, it was closer. Too close for comfort. It stood right at the edge of the clearing, staring up at the tower. I could see its features more clearly now, though they made no sense. It looked like a person, but its proportions were wrong. The arms were unnaturally long, hanging limp by its sides. The face, if it could even be called a face, was a dark smudge, nothing distinguishable. Just a void of blackness. My hand shook as I grabbed the radio, trying to contact the ranger station, but there was nothing. No response. Just static. I tried again, harder this time, but it was as if the air itself was blocking the signal. Panic started to creep in as I stared at the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but eventually I lost sight of it. It was gone. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't alone. That much was certain. But what was out there? And why couldn't anyone hear me? That night, I locked every door and window. I checked the radio once more, but again, static. My only connection to the outside world was gone. As the hours passed, I could hear the wind picking up, but this time it wasn't just the wind. There were whispers. Soft at first, barely audible, like voices in the distance. Then they got closer, louder. They were coming from below, from the base of the tower. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard something more distinct. Footsteps. The distinct sound of boots crunching on dry leaves. They were too heavy to be an animal. too slow to be a person running. Whoever it was coming for me. I backed away from the window, my breath shallow and rapid. Suddenly, the tapping started again, faster this time. The same rhythmic tapping, this time on the side of the tower. It was as though someone or something was climbing the outer walls. I heard the scrape of nails against metal, the sound of movement that shouldn't have been possible. My mind was racing. What should I do? I couldn't stay in the tower. I couldn't climb down either. The ladder was too exposed, but there was no escape. I could hear breathing now. Low, raspy breaths like someone struggling to inhale. I turned to look out the small window, my hands trembling. The figure was there again. This time, it was right below me, its face tilted upwards, staring directly at me. Its eyes were dark, blacker than the night itself, and it smiled. Or at least, I think it did. Its mouth stretched far too wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth that glinted in the moonlight. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. The whispers grew louder, becoming almost like a chant, a rhythmic, guttural sound that seemed to echo in the back of my skull. Then, the ground shook. I don't know how to explain it, but it was as if the whole mountain trembled beneath me. The tower swayed. I could hear the metal groaning under the weight of something enormous. And then I saw it. A shadow moving beneath the tower, dark as ink, its form twisting and shifting. The whispers stopped. The shadow stopped moving. Everything was still. Too still. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to get out. I grabbed my bag, my coat, and bolted for the door. The tower had never seemed so high, so impossibly far from the ground. I descended the ladder as fast as I could, barely looking down. My feet hit the earth, and I ran without thinking. Branches whipped past my face. The forest was alive with noise, but it felt like something was following me. Something was chasing me. I could hear it in the distance, moving, always just behind me. I don't know how long I ran, or how I made it to the ranger station. All I know is that when I arrived, the rangers were waiting for me. They were already on high alert. They told me the tower was abandoned and had been for years. No one had been sent there. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to that tower. Whatever it was out there, it wasn't human. And it's still out there, watching.
Next story.
It was my first time working as a fire lookout in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I had heard stories, of course, everyone had, but I never took them seriously. Ghost stories, they said. Tales spun around campfires. Not something to actually worry about. After all, the job was supposed to be about solitude. A chance to get away from everything, clear my head, and just focus on the job. Watching for fires, scanning the horizon for any sign of smoke. Simple, right? I was assigned to a tower, high above the forest in an area that had been sparsely used for years. There were rumors about the place. They said the previous lookouts hadn't lasted long, that something about the tower drove them away. They'd leave in the dead of night without warning, and no one could explain why. Some said the forest had a way of pulling people in. Others said they saw things, strange things. But no one could be sure. I was young, eager, and too stubborn to let ghost stories dictate my life. So when I arrived at the tower, I wasn't scared, not yet. The tower was old, the wood creaked underfoot as I made my way up the narrow stairs, but it was sturdy. It had a view that stretched for miles, the jagged peaks of the mountains visible in every direction, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as I took in the beauty of it all. It felt like the entire world was at my feet. The first few days were peaceful. I spent hours scanning the horizon looking for any sign of smoke. At night, I'd write in my journal, watch the stars, and listen to the wind rustling through the trees. It was peaceful, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But then things started to change. It began with the sounds. At first, it was subtle, something I couldn't quite place. Footsteps outside the tower, creaking on the stairs, just out of sight. I'd rush to the window, but no one would be there. At first, I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but after a while, it became impossible to ignore. Then there were the whispers. It happened one night as I was sitting at the table, going over my reports. The whispers started low, like the sound of someone talking in another room, but no one was there. They'd come in bursts, quiet, almost inaudible, then grow louder. I would freeze, straining to hear, but every time I'd turn around, no one was there. The voice was always just out of reach, like it was coming from the walls or maybe the floor beneath me. I told myself it was probably just the wind again. Maybe an animal had wandered too close to the tower and was making strange noises. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, I decided to take a walk. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of something I couldn't explain. As I walked along the narrow path that led away from the tower, I could feel my pulse quicken like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt trail and the wind rustling through the branches. Then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the trees, there was a faint flicker of light. It was too steady to be a firefly, too bright to be an animal's eyes. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. The light seemed to pulse like it was breathing, and for a moment I felt as though it was calling to me. Something deep inside me told me to turn back, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, as though the forest itself was holding me there. The light flickered again, then vanished, swallowed up by the night. I blinked, and for a brief moment, I thought it was a trick of my eyes. But when I turned around to head back to the tower, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft but distinct, following me. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The forest was silent again, too silent. It was as if the world had held its breath. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the isolation was getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. The whispers returned, louder this time, and I realized they weren't just in my head, they were real. They seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, the floorboards, the air itself. It was around the third night that it all came to a head. I was sitting at the table again, trying to distract myself from the growing dread that had settled over me. The whispers were louder now, and they seemed to be saying something I couldn't quite make out. It was almost as though they were in my ear, right next to me. I stood up, feeling a cold sweat break out across my back. I rushed to the window, desperate to see anything, any sign of movement, any explanation. And that's when I saw him. At the base of the tower, standing just out of the light of the lantern, was a figure. A man. Tall, gaunt, his face hidden in shadow, his eyes glowing an unnatural yellow. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me. I froze, too terrified to even breathe. My heart hammered in my chest, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in me was screaming to run, to get out of there. But I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, staring at this figure, wondering if I was seeing things. The whispers grew louder, frantic, urging me to look away. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my gaze from the figure below. And then, suddenly, he moved. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate, and I saw it. The twisted, grotesque smile stretched across his face. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw something flicker in them, something that wasn't human. And then he was gone. Disappeared into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. I ran outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. There was no sign of him. No footprints, no trail. It was as if he had never been there, like he had melted into the night itself. I tried to call for help, but the radio crackled with nothing but static. No one would come. I was alone. The next few days blurred together. I could barely sleep. The whispers were constant now, always just out of reach. They seemed to be getting closer, growing louder, until I couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore. The figure, or whatever it was, had never returned, but the terror lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. I tried to leave, but something always kept me there. Every time I attempted to make my way down the path to the base of the mountain, something would stop me. The forest seemed to close in around me, pulling me back, whispering my name in voices that were no longer human. I knew I couldn't escape. I knew I was trapped. It was then that I realized the truth. The tower wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was hungry. I don't know how long I've been here now. Days, weeks, maybe longer. Time doesn't matter anymore. The whispers never stop. The figure never comes back, but I know he's out there, watching, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. If you're reading this, don't come looking for me. The tower has claimed me, and it will claim you too. The forest won't let you leave. It never does. Please don't make the same mistake I did.
Next story.
It was supposed to be an easy summer job. I was 22, fresh out of college, and looking for something to do before starting my career. The fire lookout position was advertised as a quiet, isolated role in the mountains, with a modest paycheck and lots of time to reflect. I didn't mind the isolation. I liked it, actually. The idea of spending a whole season alone in the wilderness seemed like a dream. They assigned me to a tower on the edge of the Lhasa National Forest, a place I had only vaguely heard of. The tower itself was basic, just a small cabin with windows that allowed a panoramic view of the surrounding area. It was on a ridge, perched high above the trees, accessible only by a long dirt road, and out of the way enough that I wouldn't see another soul unless I specifically needed help. I was given a radio, maps, and instructions on how to spot fires. They told me that most of the fires in this area were small and easy to manage, and the real danger came from lightning strikes. But the place had a strange reputation. Every year, someone from the fire lookout job would leave early. It was never the same person twice, and there were no real explanations, just rumors. Some said it was because the isolation was too much to handle. Others said it was the noises at night, the creaking of the tower, the scratching on the walls. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was the kind of thing that people exaggerated about to make the job sound more exciting. The first couple of days were beautiful. The forest stretched out below me, a sea of green, with the occasional break that revealed the towering peaks of the mountains. I spent my time looking for any signs of smoke, getting familiar with the surrounding terrain. The only sound I heard most of the time was the wind rustling through the trees, or the occasional bird call. But then, on the third night, things started to feel off. I had just settled into my routine, eating my canned food, reading books, and passing the time with the radio that barely picked up anything. As night fell, the forest grew quieter than usual. No animals, no birds, just a deep silence that hung in the air. Around midnight, I heard something. Faint at first, but growing louder. It sounded like footsteps coming from the stairs that led up to the tower. I froze, thinking it might be an animal, maybe a bear or a deer. But the steps were too deliberate, too slow. They weren't animal in nature. They were human. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and rushed to the window. But there was no one there. Nothing. Just the pitch-black wilderness. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but my gut told me otherwise. It wasn't the first time I'd heard about strange things happening in these towers. There had been reports of things like this, strange noises that didn't belong to the wild creatures, things that couldn't be explained. I didn't sleep much that night. The next few days were strange, too. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the tower shake. The radio would crackle with static, as if trying to pick up some hidden frequency. The whispers started then, too. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the tower itself settling, but the whispers didn't sound natural. They weren't like the wind. There were words, murmurs, too soft to catch clearly, but they were unmistakably there. It was as if someone, or something, was standing right outside the window, just beyond the glass. I tried to ignore it, but by the fourth night, the whispers grew louder. They became almost insistent, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. I would hear them when I was alone, sitting at the table when I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. The voices seemed to be coming from everywhere. Outside the tower, under the floorboards, in the walls. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but their tone was always the same. Cold, menacing, urgent. That night, I decided to go outside and check the perimeter. I needed to know if something was really out there, or if I was just losing my mind. It was around midnight when I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air. The forest was unnervingly still. The whispers had stopped, but there was something else, an oppressive, suffocating silence. My breath hung in the air like smoke. I circled the tower, shining my flashlight into the trees, listening for any movement. There was nothing. But as I walked around to the back of the tower, my flashlight landed on something that made my stomach drop. There, on the side of the building, just under the window, were fresh handprints. Small, muddy handprints, as though someone had pressed their hands against the wall. But there was no one around. I looked up, expecting to see someone in the trees, maybe a person playing some kind of prank, but the forest was completely still. The handprints were too perfect, too precise to have been made by an animal. I backed away slowly, my heartbeat quickening. The tower felt suddenly larger, more imposing, as if the very structure was alive, watching me. I didn't return to the tower immediately. Instead, I huddled by the trees, waiting for the sun to rise. I had to wait until morning. The whispers were still there, haunting the edges of my mind, but I didn't hear them as clearly now. The sun came up, and with it, the light gave me a false sense of security. That morning, I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe the handprints had been made by someone who had been up here before. Maybe some tourists or hikers had gotten too close to the tower. Maybe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew the truth. This place was not normal. That night, it got worse. The whispers returned with a vengeance, louder than ever, rising to a crescendo in my mind. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed up the tower stairs once again. This time, I didn't bother going to the window. I stayed inside, my heart hammering in my chest as I listened to the heavy breathing outside, just beyond the door. Suddenly, the door to the tower swung open, violently, but no one was there. I ran to the radio, trying to reach someone, anyone, but all I got was static. That was when I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to leave. I grabbed my pack and headed for the stairs. As I stepped out of the tower, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The forest, usually so beautiful and calming, now felt like a maze of shadows, full of eyes watching me from every angle. I ran down the dirt path, and as I glanced back over my shoulder, I saw it. A figure standing at the top of the tower, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. It was tall and thin, with ragged clothes. It was watching me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring down at me. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not looking back, not stopping until I reached the base of the mountain. I don't know how I made it back to civilization. I barely remember the drive down. The only thing I remember clearly is the image of that figure, watching me from the tower. I left the job early, of course, and I never went back. They say the forest is haunted, that the spirits of those who worked in the fire lookout towers are still trapped there. They say the land is cursed, that the whispers are the souls of the lost, trying to reach those who come after them. I don't know if that's true, but I do know one thing. I'll never forget what I saw. And I'll never set foot near that tower again.
Next story.
I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories or paranormal activity. I liked science, logic, and things that could be explained with reason. That's why when I took a job as a fire lookout in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, I thought it would be an easy, quiet gig. What could go wrong, right? I was wrong. So wrong. It was late summer when I arrived. The sun was starting to set as I climbed the steep mountain trail leading to the tower. The only sounds around me were the rustling of the leaves and the distant calls of birds. The place felt peaceful, remote, and untouched by the world. That's why they put fire lookouts here. No one for miles, except the occasional hiker or forest ranger. The first day passed without incident. The view from the tower was breathtaking. Miles of endless forest, mountains, and rivers stretched out before me. I spent my time scanning the horizon for any signs of smoke, marking off time on my schedule, and reading books to pass peaceful in. It was peaceful, like living in a different world where nothing could touch me. But on the second night, things started to change. Around 2 a.m., as I sat in the tower, reading by the dim light of my lantern, I began to hear something faint, a tapping sound. It was subtle at first, like something brushing against the side of the tower. I didn't think much of it. Probably a branch caught in the wind or an animal climbing the trees. But the tapping continued, and then it turned into scratching, sharp and deliberate, as if someone or something was dragging its nails along the wooden beams. I froze, my blood running cold. The wind had stopped, and all was eerily still outside. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight and check the surrounding area. Maybe it was a bear, a raccoon, or some other nocturnal animal. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing but the darkness of the forest stretching endlessly below me. I waited, heart pounding, wondering if I was just imagining things. The scratching stopped for a few moments, but then came a soft thud, followed by a low, hollow voice. So quiet, I almost couldn't hear it. Let me in. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but I couldn't. There was no one out there. The tower was high above the ground, and there was no way anyone could have gotten to the base without me hearing them approach. I wanted to ignore it, to dismiss it as some trick of the wind or my imagination. But the voice came again, clearer this time. Let me in. Please. I couldn't stay in the tower, I realized. If someone needed help, I had to do something. My legs were shaking as I climbed down the narrow ladder to the bottom of the tower. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to steady my breath, and I opened the door. The moment I stepped outside, the air felt different, cold, heavier, almost oppressive. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie stillness. I swept the flashlight beam across the ground, scanning the area for any signs of life. Nothing. No footprints. No movement. The darkness swallowed the light as it stretched out beyond the reach of the beam, but there was nothing unusual. Nothing, except for the faintest trail of something. Something unnatural leading off into the forest. I followed it, my heart hammering in my chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. The trail was strange, like something had dragged its body through the leaves, leaving deep gouges in the dirt. It twisted and turned, leading me further away from the safety of the tower. The forest felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence, it was the feeling that something was watching me. The trees loomed like dark, skeletal giants, their branches swaying as though moving in rhythm with my every step. I was acutely aware of every sound, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, my shallow breathing, the beat of my racing heart. And then, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the flashlight's glow. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body slender and elongated. I couldn't make out its features, but its form seemed to shimmer, like smoke swirling in the darkness. It was the thing from the voice, I realized. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to flee back to the tower and lock myself inside. But my feet would move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its presence pressing down on me like an invisible weight. Please, the voice whispered again, this time louder. Let me in. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to get away. But something in me, the rational part that couldn't ignore the reality of the situation, compelled me to ask, "Who are you?" There was a long pause, and then the figure's head tilted as if considering the question. It took a step closer, its form becoming clearer. I could see it now, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones, its eyes empty, black voids. Its lips, if they could be called that, curled into a smile that was more chilling than comforting. "I was once like you," it said, its voice like a breeze, thin and ethereal. "But now I am the forest, I am the wind, I am the shadow in the trees." The words didn't make sense, but I felt a chill race down my spine as I realized something. The figure wasn't just a person, it was something more. It was part of the land, part of the wilderness that surrounded me, and it had been waiting for me. I stumbled backward, the flashlight dropping from my hand and landing with a clatter on the ground. The figure reached out, its elongated fingers stretching toward me, and I felt an overwhelming pull to it, like it was calling me to join it. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My legs finally gave in to the panic, and I turned and ran, running faster than I ever had in my life, the cold breath of the figure nipping at my heels. I didn't stop until I was back in the tower, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I didn't dare look out the windows again. I didn't even turn on the lantern. I sat in complete darkness, waiting for morning, praying that the sun would rise and drive away whatever it was I had seen. The sun did rise, but the terror never left. The days that followed were filled with dread, the constant feeling that something was lurking just outside the tower, watching. I radioed for a ranger to come check on me, but when they arrived, they found nothing. No sign of the figure, no strange trail through the woods. Everything was as it should have been. But I knew the truth. The forest had marked me. The thing I had seen was no mere figment of my imagination. It was real, and it would always be there, waiting for me, whispering from the shadows. I left the job the next day. They tried to offer me a new assignment, but I couldn't go back. The figure was still out there. It was always out there, and sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I can hear it again, the voice. Let me in.
Next story.
I thought it would be a peaceful summer. A few months away from civilization, just me and the trees, the mountains, and the clear skies. My job was simple enough: watch for fires, report anything suspicious, and maintain the fire lookout tower. I was the only one there, perched high above the world with nothing but the occasional radio check-in from the ranger station below. I'd signed up for the solitude. Little did I know it would become my worst nightmare. It started on the third night. The first two had been perfectly calm. No animals, no strange noises, just the rustle of the wind through the trees. But that third night, something was off. I didn't know what exactly, but a strange unease had settled in my gut. It wasn't just the isolation, although that certainly played a part. There was something in the air, something that felt wrong. I had just finished my last check-in for the night when the wind picked up. It howled through the forest, rattling the windows of the tower, making the walls creak. I tried to focus on the view below, the darkened treetops stretching into the distance, but my eyes kept flicking to the edges of the trees, where the shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. I laughed it off. It's just the wind, I told myself, trying to ignore the creeping feeling of being watched. But then I heard something. Faint at first. A voice. It wasn't loud enough to be understood, but it was unmistakable. A whisper. It came from below. I walked over to the window and peered out into the darkness. Nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a mountain lion or some other predator in the area. That seemed reasonable. But then the voice came again, louder this time. Help me. I froze. My heart raced as I scanned the forest below. The wind had died down, and for a moment, the only sound was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I held my breath and waited. Nothing. I was just about to dismiss it as the wind again when I saw movement, a figure standing at the base of the tower. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its shape distorted in the low light. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, like something ancient and malevolent was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I backed away from the window, panic rising in my chest. What the hell was that? I grabbed the radio, but my hands were trembling too much to operate it. I couldn't form a sentence. My mind was racing. What should I do? Should I call for help? Should I try to get out of there? I looked back out the window. The figure was still there, but it wasn't standing anymore. It was moving, jerking in unnatural ways, almost like it was struggling to stay upright. It was slowly coming closer to the tower. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring, frozen in place. Time felt like it had stopped. I could feel the fear building inside me, an overwhelming sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Then the whisper came again. This time I could make out the words. Come down. The voice was so soft, so desperate that it sent a chill through my bones. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to respond. Who are you? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. It just continued moving closer, its unnatural movements growing more erratic, like it was being pulled toward the tower by some unseen force. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't leave. Something in the back of my mind told me that leaving the tower would be worse. It felt like I was trapped, like there was no escape. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. Is everything okay up there? Over. It was the voice from the ranger station. For a moment, I just stared at the radio, the words barely registering. I knew I had to respond, but my throat was dry and my mind was racing. Yeah, I stammered. Just the wind. There was a long pause on the other end before the voice came back. If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Over and out. I didn't know why I lied. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe I was hoping it would just go away. But the figure was still there, getting closer, and I could feel it pressing in on me, filling the small tower with its dark presence. It stopped just below the platform, its form now so close that I could hear a soft, rasping breath, like it was trying to inhale, but it was choking on the air. The voice came again, clearer now, like it was right next to me. Help me. I pressed my back against the wall, my legs too weak to hold me up. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was like the air around me had thickened, and every breath was a struggle. Then, as if it had read my thoughts, the figure slowly lifted its head and looked directly at me. It had no face, just an empty, hollow void where its features should have been. But I could feel its eyes on me. cold and unblinking. The whisper turned into a harsh, ragged voice full of anguish. "You have to come down. It's the only way." I don't know how I managed to keep it together, but somehow I did. My survival instincts kicked in. I wasn't about to climb down there and face whatever it was. I didn't care if it had once been human or if it was something else entirely. I just knew that if I went down, I wouldn't come back up. I grabbed the radio again, this time determined to get help. I barely managed to press the button. "Someone? Someone is out there. I need help," I said, my voice shaky but clear. There was a pause, and then the voice from the ranger station responded, "We'll send someone up to check on you. Stay put." The figure didn't move, but I could feel it. It was waiting for me to make a move. But I wasn't going to give in. I wasn't going to let it win. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, just as I was about to lose hope, I heard the sound of a helicopter in the distance. I rushed to the window and looked out, praying it was coming for me. The helicopter appeared, flying low, its lights flashing through the trees. It was close, so close. But as it hovered near the tower, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was no longer below the tower. It was right in front of me, standing at the door. I screamed, but it didn't respond. It just stood there, its dark presence filling the room. The helicopter kept circling, but it couldn't land. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at the ranger station, lying on a cot in a small room. I couldn't remember how I had gotten there or how much time had passed. The helicopter pilot was sitting across from me, looking concerned. "You were out cold for hours," he said. "We found the tower, but there was no one there. The door was locked, and everything was fine. You okay?" I didn't know how to respond. I could still feel it, the presence, the eyes on me. It wasn't over. I knew it wasn't over. I quit the job the next day, but the nightmares haven't stopped. The whispers still haunt me, calling me down from the tower, urging me to face whatever waits in the dark, and sometimes when the wind blows just right, I can hear it again, faint but unmistakable. Come down.
Next story.
It's hard to explain, but the events of that night still haunt me, even though it happened years ago. I'd been working as a fire lookout for a month, stationed high up on a ridge in the mountains. My job was simple: keep an eye out for smoke, report any signs of wildfires, and radio in when necessary. The area was isolated, remote even, which was what drew me to it in the first place. I wanted to escape. What I didn't expect was the eerie presence that would begin to stalk me as the days wore on. It started out slow, barely noticeable, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow passing behind the trees, or so I thought. It was always in the distance, just out of reach, and by the time I turned my gaze fully in that direction, nothing was there. The first week, I brushed it off, but the strange occurrences kept happening. It wasn't until the second week that I began to feel it, the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. On the night it all began, I had just finished my evening routine. The sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon, and the world had descended into a thick, almost suffocating darkness. It was a clear night, not a cloud in the sky. I sat near the window, gazing out at the sprawling forest below. The only sounds were the gentle wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of the tower. It was peaceful, too peaceful. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind again. A strange noise, a tap, almost like a knock. It came from below the tower. I peered through the window, but the darkness didn't reveal anything out of the ordinary. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but the tapping persisted, louder now. My nerves were on edge, but I told myself it was nothing, maybe a branch scraping against the side of the tower. But when the sound came again, I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the door. My heart was racing, and my hands were sweating as I slowly opened it, shining the light down toward the base of the tower. Nothing. No sign of movement. The ground was bare, the trees in the distance swaying gently with the wind. But as I stood there, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just a feeling. It was as if something was watching me, something hidden in the shadows. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly shut the door behind me, my heart thudding in my chest. I told myself it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks on me. But something deep inside me knew it was more than that. I tried to shake it off and went back to my station. The rest of the night was quiet, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts were too scattered, too frantic. I kept thinking I saw something just outside the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I was starting to doubt my own mind, but the fear refused to let me relax. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, couldn't stop listening for that tapping sound. The next day, I checked the base of the tower, but there were no signs of anything unusual. Still, the unease lingered. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. The tapping became more frequent, louder, and always at night. And then there were the voices. At first, it was a whisper, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. "Help me." It came from outside the tower, from the edge of the forest. I thought it was another person, maybe a lost hiker, but the voice sounded wrong. It was too distorted, like it was being dragged through mud. It sent a shiver down my spine. I called out, asking if anyone was out there, but there was no response. The whisper didn't come again that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then, the third week, it happened. I was scanning the horizon with my binoculars when I saw it. A figure. Far away at first, standing at the edge of a distant clearing. It didn't move, just stood there, staring in my direction. The figure was tall, thin, unnaturally so. Its arms hung by its sides, long and out of place. There was no face, just an empty, black void where one should have been. My breath caught in my throat, and I lowered the binoculars, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow in the trees. But when I raised them again, it was still there. This time, the figure took a step forward, slowly, deliberately. I froze. My heart pounded as I watched it move closer to the tower, each step bringing it nearer, though it never seemed to break the silence of the night. My hands shook as I fumbled with the radio, trying to reach the ranger station, but all I heard was static. I tried again and again, but there was nothing, no response, no crackle, no reassurance that someone else was out there. I was utterly alone. The figure was almost at the base of the tower now. I could see its form more clearly, and that's when I realized it was no longer walking on the ground. It was floating, its feet inches above the earth, as though it was gliding toward me. I could see its hollow black eyes, or what I assumed were its eyes, staring up at me, watching. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees, but the figure remained unnervingly still, unmoved by the gale. Then, with a jolt, it vanished, gone, as though it had never been there in the first place. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, suffocating. I stumbled backward from the window, my mind racing, my pulse thundering in my ears. Was I losing my mind? Was this all just isolation playing tricks on me? But when I turned to leave, that's when I heard the scraping again. This time it was louder, more intense, and it was coming from inside the tower. The walls seemed to shake as if something was trying to claw its way in. Panic set in. I grabbed the door handle, ready to run, but then nothing. The sound stopped. The air grew cold. I stood there, frozen, my body screaming at me to flee, but I couldn't. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't safe. Not here. Not with whatever was out there. I bolted from the tower, rushing down the ladder, barely pausing to look down. My feet hit the ground and I ran, my breath ragged, my body trembling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, chasing me, stalking me. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station. The rangers were already on alert, having received an emergency call from me earlier. They found me outside, shaking, unable to explain what had happened. I told them everything, but when they searched the tower the next morning, they found no sign of anything unusual. It wasn't until I left the mountains and returned to the city that I realized the truth. That thing, that figure, wasn't just a trick of the mind. It had followed me, not just in the forest, but in my dreams, in my thoughts. Always there, watching, waiting. I can still feel its cold presence, and I know I'll never truly escape it.
Next story.
I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. I had always dismissed the strange tales of the fire lookouts, thinking they were just that, stories. But then I took the job. It was supposed to be a quiet season. I'd signed up for the fire lookout position on a remote mountain range, something to get away from the noise of city life. The tower was located on a small ridge, and the only sounds were the occasional gust of wind and the distant call of birds. It was perfect, or at least it seemed that way. The first few days were uneventful. Just the usual routine of scanning the horizon with my binoculars and checking in with the ranger station. I spent most of my time reading, enjoying the isolation. It was peaceful, but the further I settled in, the more I started to notice odd little things. Strange noises in the middle of the night, like someone was walking around the base of the tower. I brushed it off at first. Animals, I thought, the wind playing tricks on me. But one night, it was different. I had just finished my dinner and was sitting in the small wooden chair by the window, watching the sun set behind the mountains. It was always one of my favorite parts of the day, the fading light painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. As the last sliver of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check the perimeter of the tower, just to make sure everything was secure. It was a routine I followed every evening before bed, but this time felt wrong. As I descended the ladder to the ground, the wind picked up, howling through the trees in a way that felt unsettling. My boots crunched against the dry leaves, and I scanned the dark forest around me. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I walked the perimeter quickly, my flashlight beam darting across the underbrush, but nothing unusual caught my eye. Just trees, the occasional rustle of leaves. I was about to head back up when I saw something in the distance. A figure. It was standing motionless between the trees, just at the edge of the beam of my flashlight. It wasn't moving, and I couldn't make out any details, but it was there, a silhouette. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, but when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. I shook my head. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I quickly ascended the ladder back into the tower and locked the door behind me, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was nothing. Just the isolation, just the strange sounds of the forest at night. But then came the knock. It was a soft knock at first, barely audible, coming from the door. My heart leapt in my chest. Who could it be? I wasn't expecting anyone, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, the knocking came again. Louder this time, more insistent. I hesitated, but curiosity got the best of me. I pulled the door open just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The wind howled around me, carrying with it the distant sound of rustling leaves, but there was no one there. No figure. No explanation for the knocking. I stepped back inside, closing the door and bolting it shut. My nerves were on edge. It was then that I heard it again, not a knock this time, but a whisper. Low and faint, as though someone was calling my name from just outside the tower. Help. Help me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was barely a whisper, but it felt so close. It felt real, too real. I rushed to the window, but the darkness outside revealed nothing but the silhouette of the trees against the starry sky. I grabbed the radio, desperate to reach someone, anyone, but the static was deafening. The radio wasn't working. I could hear the wind, but no one else. I stayed up the entire night, unable to sleep. My mind was racing, every little sound making my heart jump. The whispering didn't stop. It came again and again, soft and pleading, as if it was right outside the tower, waiting for me to open the door. But I didn't. I couldn't. The next day, I tried to continue with my routine. The sun had risen, and the warmth of the day made everything seem normal again. But something had changed. The atmosphere felt thicker, like the air itself was heavier. I went outside, but the sense of unease followed me everywhere. It was as if the forest itself had shifted, had become darker somehow. That afternoon, I went to check the perimeter again, determined to confront whatever it was that had been haunting me. As I approached the edge of the clearing, I saw it again, a figure standing in the distance. This time, it was closer. I could make out more details. The tall, thin form of a person, their arms hanging limp at their sides, and their face. Was that a face? I couldn't tell. The moonlight cast long shadows, and the figure was just dark enough that I couldn't make out any features. I froze. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. I took a step forward, my foot crunching against the dry leaves. As soon as the sound broke the silence, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I ran back to the tower, my pulse racing. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My breath came in sharp gasps as I sat against the wall, trying to make sense of what was happening. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. That night, I stayed inside, refusing to go outside even to check the perimeter. But the whispering started again. This time it was louder, more urgent. Help me. Please. It was coming from below the tower, from the trees surrounding it. I couldn't move. I was too terrified to even breathe. The whisper grew louder still, as though it was circling the tower, getting closer with each passing second. Then there was a knock, louder than before, more frantic. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack, my flashlight, and my radio. I bolted from the tower, scrambling down the ladder. As I ran through the woods, I could feel the air change. The coldness seeped into my bones, and that sense of being watched never left me. I kept running, not knowing where I was going, but knowing I couldn't stay there any longer. Hours later, when I finally made it to the ranger station, I collapsed in exhaustion. I don't know if they ever believed me. They probably didn't. They told me it was the wind, that it was all in my head. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. The whispering never stopped.
Next story.
I never thought I'd end up working a fire lookout tower in the middle of nowhere, especially after hearing all the unsettling stories surrounding the job. But after losing my job in the city and not being able to land another one, I figured it was a chance to escape, to breathe in the fresh air, and, if I'm being honest, to forget the mess I'd left behind. A chance for peace. The tower was up on a mountain in the Cascade Range of Washington, far away from the nearest town. It was supposed to be an easy job, a lookout in case of fires, just keeping watch during the day and reading books or writing at night. It sounded perfect for me. No distractions, no stress, no people. I arrived in the early afternoon and was immediately taken by the view. The tower was perched on a ridge, with mountains stretching for miles in every direction. The quiet was almost deafening, and I welcomed it. The only thing I had to worry about was the job, and even that felt like a break compared to the chaos I had left behind. I was told there had been other lookouts before me, but none had stayed more than a few weeks. They said it was nothing to worry about, just the isolation. But when I asked a little more, I got only vague answers and a lot of, "You'll see." I shrugged it off. What was the worst that could happen? The first few nights were peaceful. I spent my time writing, reading, and trying to get comfortable in my new environment. But then, on the fourth night, things started to shift. It was late, just past midnight. I was standing in front of the window, watching the stars, when I heard it, a soft knock on the door. It was so faint that at first I thought it might have been the wind, but the more I thought about it, the more certain I was that I had heard something. I went to the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there. I stepped outside, scanning the darkness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. There was nothing. No sign of movement, no animal tracks. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me and went back inside me, but the knocking continued. The next night, it happened again. Soft, hesitant taps against the door, just enough to make me question my sanity. And it wasn't just at night. During the day, I started hearing strange noises, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the creaking of the tower when there was no wind. At first, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but it was hard to ignore the growing sense of unease that settled in my chest. Then the whispers started. They weren't like the sounds of animals or the wind. These were distinct voices, soft at first, almost soothing. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, curling around me, just out of reach. I tried to focus on the fire lookout job, to clear my mind and stay sharp, but the voices were relentless. They whispered my name, murmured things I couldn't understand. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced someone was standing at the foot of my bed, but when I would sit up, there was nothing there. On the seventh night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted from the constant whispering, the strange knocks, the eerie feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to leave the tower for a while to get some fresh air and clear my head, but as I made my way down the narrow path to the edge of the ridge, I froze. There in the distance was a figure standing by the base of the tower. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of a person, unmoving. The air grew still, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I called out, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, as if waiting for something. For me, I didn't want to find out. I turned and ran back up the path, my heart racing. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, expecting the figure to be right behind me. But when I reached the tower, I glanced back, and the figure was gone. Just vanished. I spent the rest of the night locked inside, not daring to go outside again. I was more scared than I had been in a long time, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I had to be. It was just the isolation messing with my head, right? But the next day, the door was different. When I woke up, I went to make my coffee and noticed something strange. The door, which I had locked the night before, was ajar. Not wide open, but just slightly cracked. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped closer. I hadn't left it like that, and no one else had been up here. I pushed the door open, and my stomach dropped. On the floor right in front of the door were fresh footprints. Small, muddy footprints leading inside the tower. They were too small to be mine and too clean to be from any animal. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the trail with my eyes. It led to the corner of the room where I had left a pile of papers, my journal, and a few books. But something was off. One of my journals was open, pages flipping as if someone or something had been reading it. I ran to it, and my hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, looking for any sign of what had happened. And that's when I saw it. Written in the back of the journal, scrawled in jagged, almost frantic handwriting, was one sentence. "They're coming for you." I couldn't breathe. I slammed the journal shut and backed away from the corner, looking around the tower, my eyes darting to the window, the door, the stairs. But there was nothing. No one. The rest of the day was a blur. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining things, but the evidence was there. The footprints, the open door, the message in the journal. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the air with a constant low murmur. They weren't just voices anymore. They were commands. "Leave," they said. "Get out." And that's when I realized I couldn't stay any longer. I packed up what little I had, trying to keep my hands steady as I hurried to the door. As I left, I turned to look back at the tower, but when I did, I saw it. A figure standing in the window watching me, the same figure from the night before. I ran. I don't know how far I made it before I collapsed, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what would have happened if I had stayed. I just wanted to forget. But even now, I still hear those whispers sometimes. They follow me in the quiet of the night, haunting me with that single sentence from the journal, "They're coming for you." And I can't help but wonder, was I really alone up there, or did something else want me to stay?
Next story.
It was a quiet night like any other, or so I thought. I had been working as a fire lookout in the remote wilderness for a few weeks. The job was peaceful, just me, the towering trees, and the endless stretches of wilderness. I had heard the stories, of course, the ones about strange happenings in the deep woods. But I wasn't a superstitious person. I was practical, a fire lookout. All I had to do was stay alert for fires. Nothing else mattered. That first night, I noticed something odd, though. I had just finished my dinner and was sitting near the window, looking out over the forest below. The sun had set, and the world was bathed in the cool, violet hue of dusk. I ran my binoculars over the horizon, as I always did, but this time something caught my eye. A figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a hiker or a lost soul wandering in the distance. But when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. The figure stood in the middle of a clearing, perfectly still. It was too far for me to make out details, but there was something unsettling about the way it was positioned. Like it was waiting. My heart started to race. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that it was probably just someone passing through. But there was no trail that led through that part of the forest. No paths. I would have noticed if there was. I grabbed the radio and tried to contact the ranger station, but there was nothing but static. I checked it again, fiddling with the knobs, but still nothing. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound coming from outside the tower. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It was too deep, too heavy. I stood up, my legs trembling. I tried to peer through the window, but the figure was gone. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was all in my mind. The forest was vast, mysterious. Maybe it was just a shadow or an animal I had mistaken for a person. But then the sound came again. A tap. No, not a tap, a scratch. The unmistakable sound of something clawing at the wooden walls of the tower. It came from below, and then it moved up the side of the tower, slowly, relentlessly. The scratch grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the window. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I took a step back, my breath shallow. My heart was pounding in my chest. I should have called for help, but there was no way to reach anyone out here. The radio was still dead. My only choice was to wait. Wait and hope that whatever was outside would leave. But it didn't. The scratching continued. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking as I tried to steady the beam. I aimed it through the window, but all I saw was darkness. The forest was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the flashlight beam. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe it had moved on. But then I heard something else. A whisper. It was barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." The voice sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't human. It sounded wrong, like it was being dragged through gravel. It wasn't coming from below the tower anymore. It was coming from inside the walls. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whisper grew louder, as if something was clawing its way toward me from behind the walls of the tower itself. "Help me. Let me in." I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. The voice was so close now, it was as if the thing, whatever it was right next to me. I glanced at the door. It was still locked, but for some reason it felt vulnerable. The floor creaked and I spun around, expecting to see something in the corner of the room. Nothing. Just the oppressive darkness closing in around me. Then came the worst part. The scratching, the whispering. It stopped. For a moment there was complete silence. A silence so heavy, so unnatural that it felt like the world was holding its breath. And then came a loud bang, like something had slammed into the door. I stumbled backward, heart racing. I couldn't think. I had no plan. I couldn't stay here. Not with that thing outside. I rushed to the door, unlocked it, and flung it open, not even sure what I was planning to do. But when I stepped outside, there was nothing. The forest was eerily quiet. The same silence I had come to expect on these lonely nights. But the air felt thick, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I turned in every direction, but there was no sign of the figure I had seen earlier. No sound of movement. Only the faint rustling of the trees in the breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had followed me out here. I decided to go back into the tower and lock the door again. But as I reached the ladder, something caught my eye. A trail of footprints. But they weren't normal footprints. They were deeper, as if someone or something had walked through the mud, leaving behind large, unnatural prints. I froze. The prints led up to the base of the tower, and from there, they disappeared into the night. But there was something more, something that chilled me to my core. At the base of the ladder was something small, almost insignificant at first glance, but when I crouched down to look, my stomach turned. A torn piece of fabric, stained, dark, and unmistakably human. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, my thoughts jumbled. I wanted to leave, but I was stuck. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I climbed back up the ladder and locked the door behind me. But the whispering started again. This time, though, it wasn't from behind the walls. It was outside the window, low and guttural. "Let me in." I turned, my eyes wide with terror, but all I saw were the trees swaying gently in the wind. Nothing. Nothing but the vast emptiness of the wilderness. The whisper grew louder, more frantic. "Let me in! Let me in! You're not alone!" The words were becoming clearer now, and I knew, whatever it was out there, it had been waiting for me. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it was real. I don't know how long I stayed up there, too terrified to sleep, too terrified to move. I don't know what happened after that night. The next morning, when the rangers found me, I was in a state of shock. I couldn't remember much. I only remember the sound of the scratching, the whispering, the feeling that something was in the forest with me, watching, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand what happened out there. But I know this much: if you ever take a job as a fire lookout, be careful what you're looking for, because some things in the forest are better left unseen.
Next story.
I was an outsider to the area, fresh off a backpacking trip with no real plans and a deep yearning for some peace and quiet. So when I heard about a seasonal job as a fire lookout in the northern part of Idaho, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. It was a simple enough job: Stay in a lookout tower, watch for wildfires, and report any signs of smoke. I'd be alone, which didn't bother me. In fact, the isolation was part of the charm. The tower was about an hour from the nearest town, perched high on a ridge deep in the wilderness. The kind of place you'd never stumble upon unless you were looking for it. The forest stretched out like a vast ocean of green, unbroken and wild, with nothing but mountains and trees as far as the eye could see. When I arrived, the tower seemed almost like a relic of the past, weathered, wooden, and a little crooked. But it had all the essentials: a cot, a stove, a small table, and windows that gave you a 360-degree view of the landscape. The woman who had been working there before me had left early, but she was friendly enough, and after a brief exchange of instructions, I was on my own. The first few days were blissful. I woke early to the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I spent my afternoons reading or writing in my journal, and my evenings watching the sky turn purple and gold as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The quiet was beautiful. There was no traffic, no noise, just the natural rhythm of the forest and the occasional crackling of the firewood. But as the days wore on, things started to get strange. At first, it was little things. A shadow darting at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I looked directly at it. The occasional strange rustle in the trees, like something was moving through the underbrush but never quite close enough to see. But it was the sounds that truly unsettled me. The low, distant hums at night, the sort that you might dismiss as wind at first. But there was something too rhythmic about them, too consistent. One evening, while sitting on the small deck outside the tower, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the gravel path below. I froze, straining to listen, but no one appeared. I stood up, peering over the edge of the railing, my heart pounding. There was no one down there, just the whispering of the wind through the pines. I convinced myself that it was just a deer, or maybe an elk. There was no way it was anything else. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air was thick with it, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The next few nights were worse. The sounds grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like something was walking around the tower, but when I opened the door to check, there was nothing there. I started to notice things out of place. My maps, the ones I'd carefully hung on the wall, were shifted when I came back to the tower after my rounds. My gear, which I'd left neatly arranged, was moved. It wasn't enough to be certain that someone was messing with me, but it was enough to make me uneasy. One night I heard knocking, soft at first, like a tapping on the wood. It came from inside the tower. I shot up from my cot, my heart thumping in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the walls. Nothing. The beam flickered as I moved it across the room, catching on the dark corners, the dusty floorboards. But there was no one there. I thought I'd imagined it, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I knew I had to get out of there. But when I went to leave the next morning, my truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, but refused to turn over. Frustrated and confused, I checked the battery and the fuel line, but everything seemed fine. I tried again and again, but the truck didn't budge. I was stuck. That's when things really started to spiral. One evening, while I was sitting at the table, reading my book to pass the time, I heard a soft tap on the window. I jumped up, turning to face it, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I approached the window. My hand shook as I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. I tried to dismiss it, but the tapping continued, not just at the window, but all over the tower. It seemed to come from all directions, as though something was circling me, gently knocking on the walls, the windows, the floor. I started to feel like I wasn't alone, and it wasn't the kind of alone you feel when you're used to being by yourself in nature. This was different. It was like someone, or something, was lurking just outside my sight, watching me, waiting. I could feel it. The tension in the air was palpable. Then, one night, I woke to the unmistakable sound of whispering. I sat up straight, my pulse pounding. The whispers were soft at first, so faint that I wasn't sure I was hearing them at all. But as I strained to listen, they grew louder, and they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside the tower, from the walls themselves. I leapt out of bed, flashlight in hand. My fingers trembled as I flicked the switch, illuminating the room with the harsh beam. The whispers stopped immediately, leaving an eerie silence behind them. I checked every corner of the room, every nook and cranny, but there was nothing. The air was heavy, and I could taste the coppery taste of fear in the back of my throat. I checked the door, still locked. The windows, sealed tight. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel the presence. The weight of it was suffocating. The following morning, I made up my mind to leave. I didn't care if the truck wouldn't start. I wasn't staying another night in that tower. But when I tried again, the engine roared to life as if nothing had been wrong. I didn't even stop to grab my belongings. I just slammed the door behind me and sped down the mountain, my tires kicking up gravel. I didn't look back. I never returned to the fire lookout tower. It sits there now, empty in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees that whisper in the wind. I heard rumors later that the previous fire lookout had experienced similar things. Strange noises, unsettling sensations, things that couldn't be explained. And I've heard other stories about people who've worked in towers like mine, places where the forest seems to have a life of its own, and not the kind that's welcoming. I don't know what was in that tower. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was something else, something older, something that belonged to the forest, but I'm certain of one thing. I wasn't meant to stay there, and I'll never go back.
Next story.
I never thought it would happen to me. I had heard the stories, of course. The ones whispered around campfires by the older guys, the ones you dismiss as urban legends and ghost stories to pass the time. But when I was assigned to work at a fire lookout in the middle of the wilderness, I couldn't help but brush it off. After all, I was prepared. I had training, I had the skills, and I had no reason to believe in things that went bump in the night. It was supposed to be a simple job, staying in the tower for a few months, keeping an eye out for any signs of wildfire. The fire lookout tower was perched high on a mountain, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest. The isolation was part of the charm for some people. For me, it felt like freedom. No distractions, no noise, just me and the trees. But the first night was when things started to unravel. I remember it clearly. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was streaked with purple and orange. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The radio crackled to life with routine check-ins from the ranger station, and I went about my duties, monitoring the area. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound. A tapping. At first I thought it was just the wind, the trees creaking in the cool night air, but as the sound grew louder, it became more deliberate. Tapping, scratching, followed by a low thudding noise. It came from the side of the tower, just out of sight. My heart rate quickened, and I found myself walking to the window, looking down into the dark abyss below. Nothing. Just darkness. The forest seemed alive with the rustle of unseen creatures, but there was no sign of anyone near the tower. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up my spine. It's just the wind, I muttered to myself. But even as I said it, I felt that nagging doubt. I went back to my work, but the tapping didn't stop. It continued at intervals, each time sounding closer, like something or someone was moving around the base of the tower. My nerves were shot. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I should have felt safe, alone with nature. But the isolation was starting to feel more like a trap. Around 2 a.m., I decided to check the radio again. Maybe I'd missed something earlier. Maybe I wasn't hearing things. I grabbed the mic and radioed the ranger station, asking if anyone else was out there, maybe doing a late-night patrol or something. The voice on the other end was calm and reassuring, the same voice I'd heard on my check-ins. "Negative," he said. "There's nobody else up there. You're the only one on the mountain tonight." That's when the unease turned into dread. The tapping had stopped for a while, but it picked up again, louder now, faster, almost frantic. It was followed by what sounded like a low growl, a sound so guttural it made my blood run cold. I was alone. I had no weapons up, no way to defend myself if whatever was out there decided to come up to the tower. I grabbed the flashlight and peered out the window. There was no moonlight, just the dim glow of my lamp inside the tower. For a moment, everything was still. Too still. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing at the base of the tower. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall. its outline distorted like it was made of shadow. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. Cold, empty, malevolent. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. My thoughts were racing. Was it a person? A bear? A hallucination? Then, a voice, low and guttural, barely audible, came from outside the window. It sounded like a whisper, but it was as if the words were being dragged through gravel. Help me. I recoiled, my skin prickling with terror. My mind screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in the tower, hundreds of feet off the ground, with only the trees and the night for company. The wind howled, rattling the tower as if urging me to stay inside. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to stay away from the window, but something in me, the same part of me that had been trained to spot fires, wanted to look again to confirm what I had seen. Was it real? I peered out again, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure was still there, closer now. The tapping started up again, this time from above. It came from the roof of the tower. I screamed, dropping the flashlight. The growl returned, louder, closer, almost inside my head. Panic surged, and I bolted for the ladder to climb down, but as I touched the first rung, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned, my back pressed against the cold metal door. My hands were shaking, and my breath was shallow. The growl had changed, now a low, rumbling laugh. I was losing my mind. There had to be a logical explanation for this. There had to be. But the night continued, and the terror grew. The tapping, the growling, the whispers, they never stopped. And no matter how many times I called into the radio, no one responded. The night stretched on, endless, as if the world had forgotten I was there, trapped in the tower with whatever it was that stalked me from below. Eventually, the sun came up. I don't remember how I made it through the night. I remember the exhaustion, the confusion, the raw fear. The forest was quiet again, the sounds gone as if they had never been. I radioed in and was told to come down to the ranger station for my next shift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from the tower. I never went back to that lookout. I left the job the very next day. I couldn't explain what happened to me up there. Some days I think it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. Too much isolation, too much stress, but I know better. There's something in the wilderness, something ancient and dark, and when you're up there alone, far from civilization, it can find you. It can whisper to you. It can show you things you can't unsee, and I still hear it sometimes. The tapping, the growling, the whisper begging me for help. It's out there, waiting.